Hello everyone, my name is Luke Whitehead and welcome back to the Coach Safe Imola YouTube channel. Once again it's that time of the week and we are going to be going over the LMG3 daily races for this week. So that's the LMG3 fixed race, the LMG3 sprint cup and the WEC Xperience races. So without further ado, let's get into it. And first things first, for the LMG3 sprint cup we have Silverstone National. So the shortest lap on the game, around a 52-53 second lap for the GT3s. But despite that, there is still quite a bit of technicality involved. For example, Cops is obviously very, very difficult on its own. The Maggots and Beckett's complex, which is very different to usual. So there is still quite a lot to go over. So without further ado, let's get into it. So coming down towards Cops, you want to brake just before the Goodyear board on the left, or just before the red barrier ends here. I usually brake around the car length before that. Down to gear 4. Try and hook the inside curb a little bit. You can use these sausage curbs on the right, but they can unsettle the car quite a bit. And as I say, the curb already does hook you around quite a lot, so the car can be a little bit sketchy on the curb anyway. And if you try and take more, it would be that exemplified, I suppose. So, but as you can see, we take a little bit of the red and white, get back on the throttle, mid-corner, let the car run up to the exit curb. Again, not running too much of that exit curb because it is very, very easy to invalidate, so be very, very mindful of that. And now bring the car over to the right hand side, ready for Maggots and Beckett's. And you want to brake in a massively straight line. Your reference is roughly that crane, so you can see that crane just up there. You want to brake around the car length after that. So you can see we actually brake probably a car length or two before the end of the sausage curb. So it's all about preference really. You have brake references here, but they're not exact references. So you need to try and find where you can fit around those and where it can work best. But I generally find kind of middle of this sausage curb. Make sure you're braking in a dead straight line. Because if you're braking while turning it, we engage the ABS and you just won't make the corner at all. So just be very, very mindful that you have to aggressively point up for Maggots and Beckett's, unlike what you usually do. But you need to make sure you're braking dead straight. And you can see we get that quite nicely into here. Down to gear 2. Turn in, just starts trading off the brake and turning in just after these red sausage curbs here. Because you want to try and aim to hit the back of that sausage, the back of that curb, sorry. And you can see we hit the back of the red and white. We do hook a little bit of the black here, but again, not too much, because it's very easy to invalidate here. If you even touch the black, I got quite a few invalidations just by touching the black. I think it's based on your outside tyre though, but again, it does seem a little bit inconsistent. So again, you still get good hooking through the black and white curb, so there's not really much merit to hooking any more of that curb. So just be very mindful of the track limits here. Get back on the throttle mid-corner, let the car run out to the exit curb. Again, don't run out too far because this curb is kind of elevated above the tarmac. So you can see there's those ridges on the curb, which can drag you out quite wide. And they can also make your momentum really poor if you do take too much exit curb. So just be very, very mindful. Don't take too much exit curb out of here. And then let the car run out nice and wide. Use that black tarmac on the left if you need it. And now you can bring the car right over to the right-hand side, ready for Brooklands, the hardest braking zone on the circuit. You want to brake at around the start of this red barrier on the right hand side. You see we point the car up a little bit early as well as we start braking. So you want to try and brake towards the apex. There's not a lot of grip on the outside of the corner, so you want to try and get along that curb and try and be as close to that curb as you can, or as close to the white line as you can at the very minimum. Down to gear 2, we get a bit of a slide in the middle of the corner, which means we do go a little bit wide, but again, we still managed to touch the white line, which was nice there. Let the car run out nice and wide. And now you want to brake, let the car run out via the corner off. You want to go out nice and wide because you want to try and make sure you get to the throttle nice and early and get to the throttle straight. But crucially, make sure you don't accelerate onto the gravel. It's very easy to point up too early and get on the throttle too early and then just end up on the gravel. So you do want to wait quite a long time. You can see we're very, very patient. Getting back on the throttle, clip the back of the curb again. And you can see we're letting the car run out only to the AstroTurf. We're not on the gravel. And we're not sliding the car at all either. We were very, very patient. And again, not straight to full throttle. We're going to around 3/4 throttle. And then bringing the throttle in towards the end of the corner. And that is our lap of Silverstone National. I did a 140, or not 143, sorry. Did a 53.148. So let's have a look in Coach Dave Delta. Look at some of the pedal inputs and pedal traces. Particularly in that last corner, which is very, very tricky on traction. And then we'll look at the raw hot lap before getting into the other laps. Okay, and here we are. We have that 53.148 here for Silverstone National. Now, I wanted to go over this this Maggots and Beckett's complex because, again, it's not a track or it's not a layout that we do very often. Obviously, we're used to just full sending through Maggots Beckett's and then going on to Chapel and then on to the back straight towards Stowe. But in this occasion, obviously, we're braking very, very hard. And you can see, again, the steering is more or less straight. And then as we start to turn in, that's when we start to trail off. And a very, very late apex. You can see on the map just above my head here that we do get on the throttle pretty much as soon as we hit that inside curb. And you can see, keeping it in second gear, letting the car run out nice and wide. And crucially, again, not using that extra curb as I mentioned too much, because again, if you run your left wheel onto that tarmac, it will just drag you out really far, and it will cause you really poor TC intervention and just a really poor exit in general. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see for Maggots and Beckett's, particularly on the first lap. Obviously, there are going to be incidents into here, so be very, very careful. But it's going to be very interesting to see whether this is even an overtaking opportunity. Because in my head, it would be this corner and Brooklands that would be the main corners for overtaking opportunities. Obviously, very exit reliant, you know, from the Maggots and Beckett's section as to whether you can get moved on into Brooklands. But it is a very, very crucial exit, which is why, again, we brake and turn in very, very late and get back to the throttle quite early and quite straight, you know, on that exit. It's a very, very important one, because again, I think Brooklands is going to be the main overtaking opportunity. So let's have a look at some final considerations for this daily race before looking at the Royal Hotlap. So for Silverstone National, it's a very, very short circuit, which means that there are very limited overtaking opportunities, and obviously it being a 30-minute race, that's going to make people want to make moves very quickly because they won't want to be stuck behind a car for the entire race. So be very, very careful at the start, particularly into Maggots and Beckett's, like I mentioned on the Delta guide there. That corner is an overtaking opportunity. It definitely is, but you need to be very, very careful and very on your toes, and you need a lot of cooperation from your other driver in that battle. So be very, very wary. It's not a move I would necessarily go for on the first lap, but I think other people definitely will. So just be very, very mindful. Just because, again, people will be eager to get positions at the start because it'll be harder and harder as the race goes on to get those positions. As for car choice, I'm a little bit unsure. I obviously chose the BMW for this lap because it has good rotation, feels nice, and has very, very good acceleration, which I think is the crucial thing for this race, for this track, I mean. Obviously, you have very few corners, so it's all about straights and about straight line speed. And while the 2-lane 6 does seem very fast here on the balance of things, it has very poor acceleration, so it will likely struggle in the race. But again, it has very good speed through cops and very good braking, so it could still be a very, very strong pick. But also, with the acceleration being a very strong factor, that does also mean that the Mustang, the Corvette, and the Aston Martin will be pretty good cars. But I think in general, the BMW and the Ferrari, and maybe even the Corvette, will probably be the strongest cars. But again, we don't do this race often, so it is a little bit up in the air. But thankfully, the lap is very short, so I don't think the bot will be massively far apart. The cars all should be much of a muchness. So, as for the race distance, though, something that I didn't cover and I actually forgot to cover, I'll just roll back to that now. It's a 30-minute race with a 52-53 second lap time, which means that you probably need to run 35 laps of virtual energy. I believe that's around 62% of virtual energy. So roughly 62, 65, around that margin should be perfectly safe. I don't think it would be possible to do more than 35 laps, because I don't think anyone will be doing 51s. But yeah, I think it's going to be a very enjoyable daily race to encounter, and I might even have a go at a few myself. So let's get into the other daily races after this hot lap. So next up, we have the WEC Xperience races, which are going to be held at Imola. Now, this track is a lot more difficult now in GT3s for a plethora of reasons, which we'll get into later. But mainly, it's the new braking system, and the brakes tend to overheat at this circuit, which means that braking into turn 1, braking into the last couple of corners is extremely difficult. And you have to be very, very mindful of your braking temperatures, be very mindful and use a lot of lift and coast to make sure your temperatures don't overheat too much on the brakes. So in general, you've got to be a lot more mindful of your technique and of how you're driving. So this track is very, very difficult, and there is also another factor which we'll come to later in the lap. So without further ado, let's get into it. So coming down towards turn 1 here, you want to brake at the little kink in the road just after the tarmac exit road on the right hand side. You're going to brake down to gear 3, use quite a bit of the left hand curb, because that hooks you around quite nicely. Use a bit of the right hand curb, don't use too much because it is very, very easy to invalidate. And even if you lift, you will lose so much time just to keep the lap valid. So just be very, very careful with the second part. Back on the throttle, short shift up to 4th. Throw the car right over the left hand curb, let the car run out. And now coming into one of the most deceptively difficult sections of the track. You're going to brake midway between these two Goodyear boards, just before the 50, so probably around 60 meters. Down to gear 4. Coast over the left hand curb, then brake in a straight line. Down to gear 3. And then you want to flick the car over the right hand curb. You can take quite a bit of this curb, and it is very useful because it does really hook the car around, which you'll see on the full hot lap. Then back to throttle. Let the car run out nice and wide on the exit curb. Again, don't run too wide because you will invalidate. And you're going to make sure to bring the car over to the right hand side as well to set yourself up for the next left hand hairpin. You see we do that nicely. You brake around the tarmac road on the left hand side. Down to gear 2. Turn in nice and late. Hit the apex in the middle of the corner. Get on the throttle just as we start to straighten out the steering. Let the car run out on the exit curb. Be careful not to run too much exit curb. Because again, the TC will intervene quite a lot. And it will cut your momentum quite a bit out of that corner. So just be very, very mindful of that exit curb. It can be very brutal. And now, up to this blind left-hander. You're going to brake out around the digiboard on the right-hand side. Or actually around the 50-meter board, sorry. Down to gear 3. Flick the car over the curb. Get back on the throttle as you hit the curb. Because the curb tends to over-rotate the car quite a bit. Tends to hook you around. Using the throttle mid-corner will help to keep that rotation going, while also putting a bit of weight on the rear, which makes sure you have makes you have good traction. So you get good rotation and good traction by using the throttle here. So it is very useful to do that. And you see we get a nice exit. Keep the car largely off that exit curb, because again we got a nice smooth exit through there, nice smooth rotation. Didn't need to use too much of that exit curb. And also if you tend to use more of this exit curb, if you tend to have your wheels more towards the gravel, then it means you have more work to do to bring the car over to the left hand side. So generally if you can take a slightly tighter exit without compromising your mid corner momentum, then that is a good thing. Bring the car over to the left hand side then, and then into this next corner, brake at the 50-meter board just before Aquamirade. And then you want to coast, trail through a little bit on the brake as well. You can see we coasted slightly and then trailed a little bit more. We're almost on and off the brake, making sure we carry just enough roll speed through, but not too much. You can see as we come off that curb, then we more heavily apply the brake. Down to gear 3, down to gear 2. We turned it a little bit early, so you can see we had to kind of take the steering away and then add it back again. So we did turn it a little bit early, but it is very, very hard to get a reference point through here because you do kind of want to take Aquamirade as one long sweeping corner that tightens at the exit. Because if you try and take it as two individual corners, then you just leave yourself vulnerable, and it's very easy to go too wide in the second part. If you take the corner as as you take Aquamirade as two separate corners, you can very easily shoot wide on the second part. But fortunately, we got a good line. Despite turning a little bit early, we were able to wind off enough steering lock to make sure we don't hit that inside sausage curb. We're all good to be through back on the throttle. Let the car run out onto that exit curb. And then bring the car right over to the left-hand side. Brake at the start of this curb on the left. Down to gear 2. And now this is where we get to the hardest part of the track. And a part of the track that has changed a little bit in this recent hotfix. So, I'll play it through once and see if you can notice what has changed. Now, it may be hard to see because it's not necessarily a visual change, but what has changed is the track limits. So, On this first curb, you were able to put your right wheels right over that sausage curb, and your left wheels were almost touching the sausage here. But now, you can only put your right wheels on the sausage, and it is very, very harsh on the track limit. The left side does seem to be a bit more lenient than previously, so you can take quite a lot of this sausage curb here. But the first part, you've got to be a lot more patient, and that does mean that the car is a lot worse over the curb. Generally, if you have to take the sausage with only one side of your car, the car will bounce quite a lot. And you can actually see that on the replay. We did get quite a lot of bouncing and instability through there. So the key is to try and take a bit less speed in, turn in a little bit later than what was previously the case. Hit the inside curb, then slow the car down, bring the car over the sausage curb, let the car run out on the exit curb, and there you have it. We'll go through that a little bit more detail on Coach Dave Delta wrap anyway. And now the final couple of corners, the brakes are really screaming out here. Braking just at that tyre mark or just after the DHL board on the right hand side. Down to gear 2. Hit the inside curb there. Let the car run out to the exit curb. Then turn in just at the end of that rumble strip there. And short shift up to third on the apex. And back to throttle. Let the car run out on the exit curb. And then the shortest possible line. Cutting a little bit of that green tarmac on the right hand side. And that is a lap of Imola on 75% virtual energy. So let's have a look at Coach Dave Delta and go through some of the other things we need to consider for this daily race before looking at the raw hot lap. So here we are. We have the 1:42.2 that we did on that lap. Now, mainly I wanted to look at Acqua Minerale and that following chicane after. Now, as I mentioned, you want to brake just before that 50 meter board. Let me just move this reference up here as well so you can see. So you want to brake just before that 50 meter board. We do coast off quite quickly, but again, we are still kind of touching the brake through here. But you can see our steering is relatively consistent and our braking kind of trails up and then trails off as we start to turn in for the second part. But we really do take it as one prolonged corner. And if you end up straightening out on the longest curb, you end up shooting really, really wide, as I briefly mentioned on that lap guide. And what I find generally is that it's easier or slightly better to take the corner as one long corner because you're encouraged to almost slow the car down earlier in the section and then you roll the speed through Acqua Minerale rather than getting all the braking done right at the apex here. We're actually getting the braking done in a straight line and a bit early, which means we can roll off the brake and carry lots of speed through this second part. So I do generally find that it just helps to set up the second part if you take it all as one corner because you're almost encouraged to brake earlier and roll more speed through at the end of the corner. And then into this second chicane, you see braking really, really hard on the initial, rolling off, using a little bit of throttle just before we get to the curb. It helps to lift the front up a little bit and just make riding the curb a little bit more smooth. But again, the bump is still really brutal. But again, other than that, it's relatively similar to how we did before. We're still getting that braking done after the curb, getting the braking, slowing down the car a little bit further in between the two parts of the chicane, getting back on the throttle after we hit that curb, letting the car run out almost to the gravel. But again, it's that first curb where you need to try and turn in a lot later than you think. And you almost have to say in the back of your mind, don't turn in, don't turn in, don't turn in. And then eventually you force yourself to have to turn in. And even then, usually it's too early. You could see on that hot lap that I turn in and then have to turn out of the corner again because I still didn't tell my brain for long enough that I need to not turn in. So it is definitely something that's going to take a lot of getting used to. But as I say, I think once you get used to it, once you get the hang of it, it's pretty straightforward, especially with the second curb being a little bit more lenient seemingly than it was in the previous patches. So let's go over some final considerations for this daily race before looking at the raw hot lap. Now, Imola. This is the WEC Xperience race, which means it's multi-class. Now, multi-class at Imola is already brutal enough, but obviously with the new braking system causing a lot of issues for the GT3s, it's going to make that a little bit more difficult. So my massive advice would be for this race to use a lot of lift and coast. You don't necessarily have to save loads of energy. Obviously, the energy limit is 75% virtual energy in a 1 hour race, so it would probably be helpful to save a bit of energy, but it's not a necessity. But I think in general, just a bit of lift and coast will help maintain slightly cooler brake temps, which will mean that your braking is slightly more consistent and better performing, particularly into turn 1 and those last couple of corners in the Ravazza. As for car choice and strategy, I think strategy will just be a one-stop, obviously. I don't think you'll be able to save for the full race distance. It's obviously a 1 hour race, so you will definitely need to pit stop. But for car choice, it's a little bit up in the air because, as I mentioned, the bop has changed recently. The Corvette did get a slight nerf, but I do still think it's the fastest. With that being said, though, it does have very poor braking, and it does suffer the brake overheating seemingly most out of the GT3 cars, along with the Ford, which does have pretty poor braking performance, but is still very fast at the circuit. The BMW does seem very, very strong everywhere, so it wouldn't be surprised if the BMW is right up there on this race. It historically has been pretty good at Imola. But of course, don't count out cars like the Ferrari, the Porsche as well, which is generally quite good over curbs as well. And obviously with that chicane being very difficult on track limits now, and you having to take the sausage curb at a very awkward angle, the Porsche might be a much better pick than was previously the case. So it's going to be definitely wide open. I think most cars will be in the 41s on quality fuel. So it'll be very interesting to see what the cars are for this week on the leaderboard. So let's have a look at that raw hot lap before looking at the final race of the day. Last but not least, we have the LMG3 fixed races, which are going to be held at Sebring, at a very, very overcast and gloomy looking Sebring, which does bring something in that I will mention later regarding the weather. It's quite an interesting one for these fixed races that we don't really have very often, but without further ado, let's go over this lap anyways. So, coming into turn 1, you're going to brake just before this barrier ends, so around a car length before the barrier ends. Down to gear 3. And then you want to let the car coast all the way through. Back to throttle just under this little 0 sign here. Let the car run out on the grass a little bit. Let the car run through. Use as much road and space as you possibly can. And then coming to the next corner, you want to brake just before the 200 board. Down to gear 2 again. Turning nice and late. But try and hit the apex. Try and hit this little corner here. Maybe not hit the curb, but try and get as close to where that yellow line should be. And you can see we do get nice and close. And then you want to straight line over this right hand curb. Again, be careful because you can either take a bump too hard or you can invalidate. We fortunately do neither. I would always say try and keep the car as straight as possible with your left wheels on the yellow, and then you'll have no issues with hitting the bump or invalidating at all either. And then you can see bring the car over to the right hand side, getting a quick dab of the brakes just after this curb on the right hand side. And then again, coasting the car through. And then right as the track corner starts to tighten the most, then you get back to the throttle. Let the car run on the exit curb. And then keep the car right along the white line for the shortest possible line up towards the next hairpin. And a very difficult braking zone into here. In the Ford at least, you want to brake just after the 400. So basically just as our rear crosses the 400. Some cars you can brake right on the 300, but the Ford you have to brake a little bit earlier. Then down to gear 1. Trail the car into the corner. You want to hook this inside curb. Get back to the throttle mid-corner, let the car run straight across this little chicane here. Or this little curving section. TC overrides over this curb as well. And a short shift over this bump. Just to make sure you don't hit the rev limiter and lose time. And then into the 90-degree right-hander. You're going to brake just before the 300 board. On the left-hand side there, so the second white line. Most cars you'll brake on the white line, but the Ford you have to brake slightly before. Same with the McLaren, you have to brake about midway between the two lines. Down to gear 2. Hook the inside curb for a bit of rotation, back to the throttle. And then try and keep the car as close to the left-hand side as you can. Let the car run out on the exit. And then into the next corner, you want to brake just before the curb, so about half a car length before the curb on the left-hand side. Down to gear 2. We didn't take quite enough curb here. You can see we only took basically the curb and a little bit of gravel there. But ideally, you do want to take quite a bit more. You want your left wheels to almost be on the yellow curb or the yellow line there, solely because it takes a smoother line. You know, in the Fords, you can take that curb smoothly, and it is slightly quicker to do so. Obviously, it shortens the corner and means you're straighter on the exit as well. So I think generally, if you take a bit more curb than this, then you will be faster. I think I lost around 600 or 700 through this middle sector, at least versus my personal best. But crucially, let the car run out and don't use too much of that exit curb. Because if you use too much of that exit curb, you can see it kind of slopes down onto the grass, so you do get really bad TC intervention there. And the car can also bottom out on that curb as well. So be very, very careful. Don't use too much of that exit curb, because it can really negatively impact your exit. And then you get a bit of breathing room now into the start of Sector 3. Take the shortest possible line, but make sure you're straight before you brake, just before the 300 board on the left-hand side. You can see here where my cursor is. Down to gear 2. Hook the inside curb, put your right wheels over that curb. You can see we got a lot more rotation the second that we just hook over that curb. Get back to the throttle, short shift to third. Put the car all the way over the left-hand curb. You don't get an invalidation for this, which is a bit of a surprise, but it's a welcome surprise. Which means you can hang the car right over to the left-hand side, brake in a straight line, down to gear 2. Trail off, hook the inside curb again, get back on the throttle super early. Let the car run on the exit curb. Again, similarly to the end of Sector 2, don't run too much of this exit curb because you can get really bad TC intervention and you can also bottom out. But we use a bit of TC override, which helps us on this exit. And now up to the most irritating corner on the circuit, particularly in the Ford, where the car really does bounce quite a lot in this final corner. Keep the car in 5th. And then point the car in really aggressively, brake right on that white line. Down to gear 3, then down to gear 2, mid-corner, trailing in, going middle of the circuit. You don't want to run too wide. You want to basically follow this rubber line here. And then roll the car through, hit the bump. As you hit the bump, then get back on the throttle right as you hit the bump. Let the car run out. Short shifts up to 3rd. Let the car run out, not too wide. And that is a lap of Sebring on fixed setup. So let's have a look on Coast Dave Delta, and then go over some final considerations for this daily race before looking at the raw hot lap. Okay, so here we are. We have the 2-minute .240 that we did on fixed setup. I wanted to go over 2 corners mainly, one of which is the final corner, which quite obviously there's a lot to unpack there. But the other corner I wanted to go over is the first corner. Now, this seems on the surface like a very simple corner, but if we bring our reference app out here, I wanted to just show one quick thing. So if we press play from here, let's just watch through turn 1 and look through one simple thing. Here. So at that 0, you can't really see it because I'm a little bit wide, but at the 0 there is a big bump. You can actually see it with the yellow line kind of undulates a little bit or moves around slightly. So there is that massive bump. And what that means on fixed setup, particularly in the Ford, but also in most of the fixed setup cars, is that the car gets really unsettled. So that's also why we boot the throttle so early in the Ford and so heavily. You can see we're pretty much straight to 85% pressure throttle input, very, very quickly. And that's again a lot of because we're trying to stabilize the car on the bump. But again, a lot of other cars are very, very difficult over that bump. Some cars you will need to wait until after the bump. So the McLaren, for example, and the Merc, I found you had to wait until after the bump. The bump would almost, coasting over the bump would almost get the car to rotate, and you'd get back to the throttle as soon as that rotation starts to happen. So it is different for every car. but it is something that I think you should be very, very much mindful of, because it is something that gets overlooked quite a lot. It is quite a simple corner, but on fixed setups, it is a bit of a prima donna. It is something you definitely need to think about. And again, with the Fords, you generally use it to rotate the car quite a bit, but you again use the throttle to try and stabilize the car, make sure it doesn't over-rotate and then bog, with obviously TC intervention. And then, of course, the final corner, bit of a weird line in the Ford, and in general I found this for most of the fixed setup cars, is that you do take quite a narrow line, and you almost try and take more speed in than you expect. But again, you have to try and get as close to that wall as you can. And you can see on the actual line up there, we're basically on the limit there with the yellow line. Obviously, as you saw on the lap guide, you take quite a bit of that inside because it helps minimize the amount of damage that bump does to your line. So obviously you have that massive bump on the apex, similarly to turn 1. And if you're a little bit wider, it'll move your car further out, and it will mean that you have to be a lot more patient on the throttle, and it'll just make your exit worse in general, and it'll make your line worse. But if you're slightly narrower, trying to turn the car through the corner, you'll hit the bump, and it will actually help to rotate the car a little bit at the very best, but also at the very least, it will just not compromise your line too much. So you've got to try and take quite a tight line there. In my opinion, at least, it's my personal preference. But again, you might like a wider line that cuts back quite late on that bump and hits the back of it and almost straightens out earlier. So there's plenty of things to do at that final corner, but I personally find that going middle of the track on the entry and turning quite early is my personal preference and does what is more consistent, especially on fixed setups. So, Sebring fixed. Surprisingly fun combo, actually. It's not a track that I tend to enjoy that much usually, but for these fixed references, I really enjoyed driving it. I had a lot of fun. But that being said, the Ford is the car we picked for the reference up, and there's a very big reason for that, and that's because it is about 2/10 clear of everything else. So, obviously, did a 2-minute .240 in the Ford. The Aston, I did a 2-minute .4. The BMW did a 2-minute .5, and then the McLaren 2-minute .6. And then everything else beyond that was a 2-minute .7, 2-minute .8 or worse. And then, of course, you had the Lambo and the Porsche, which were the hardest to drive, and in 201.3, 201.4 range. So those two cars, the Porsche and the Lambo, do not touch them, in my opinion. They are not worth using. They're really, really hard to drive, and slow. But there is one very big factor in this race that I did kind of allude to earlier. While this is a 20-minute race, it's 10 laps or 11 laps, you'll need around 50% virtual energy at absolute maximum. There is drizzle at the end of the race. So I'm not sure how much of an impact that will play, whether the track will get wet or not. Obviously, you will likely stay on slicks the whole race. But there is something very much to bear in mind towards the end of the race, especially, that the track will get very, very slippery. And for that reason, I think the Lexus could be a dark horse. The Lexus is probably best of the rest behind those top 4. It's probably the 5th quickest mid-pack, but it is very good in the slippery conditions. So I think the Lexus could be a very good shout if the track gets wet enough towards the end of the race to really cause people issues. But again, I think personally the Ford will be the most popular pick because, again, even though it is a little bit tricky to drive, it's harder to drive than the likes of the Corvette, the Ferrari, the Lexus, BMW and such. It is still very, very fast. So, but either way, I'll be interested to see how these daily races go, especially if mixed weather does come to the race later on. So, yeah, let's look at that raw hot lap then before closing out this video. And there you have it. Those are the NMG3 daily races for this week. And I hope you guys found the video helpful. If you did, make sure to leave a like, subscribe if you're new. Make sure to leave a comment down below over any videos that you'd love to see coming up on the Coach Dave LMU channel. Or if you have any other questions as well about the app, about the videos, or anything like that. I've been Luke Whitehead, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care. Goodbye.